How's it going?
Hey, Zach, it's good.
I haven't seen you in like 20 minutes.
I know I thought about changing outfits for this one, but I realized that we should just roll.
We should just let it roll. And I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I've got a lot of Gitcoin t-shirts in here. Maybe I could put one on. And then for the last interview, I turned it inside out. And then
Yeah, we could do that.
that's perfect. So remind me what we're talking about today, because we just covered interviews like contextual inquiry and kind of the two composite interview styles. What are we talking about right now?
Yeah, so as you said, like if you've been kind of following our podcasts or our videos, you've learned about users and use cases and ethnographic ways to study them in the wild over the previous kind of episodes we've put together. Today, we're here to talk about ways to kind of quickly visualize the network of people that have stake in a given system, which is called stakeholder mapping.
That sounds really interesting. So what do I like? Why do I want one? Besides just like having an idea of stakeholders, that sounds fun at least.
Yeah, so they end up turning out to be pretty invaluable because, as it kind of suggests, they document the key stakeholders, but almost more importantly, the relationships between them. So a lot of times when we design, and we've talked about this in some of the previous discussions we've had today and previously, but when we usually design a product or service, we often do it for one user, or maybe two, and we can forget to consider other stakeholders that ultimately influence whether or not a user actually uses or benefits from our product, and that can pretty much lead to an untimely death for our business. So by understanding these stakeholders early on, we can account for them in our design and work hard to mitigate their kind of influence throughout the product lifecycle.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that makes sense. And then are these something, I guess, like what's the shelf life on stakeholder mapping, generally speaking?
Yeah, so it's something that definitely becomes a permanent resource for the team and something that can be updated over time. But to me, it's something that, even in my own practice, I feel like you come back to and you reference it. If ever new people join the team, it's a great way to get people on board and understand what you're actually doing. It's great for communicating to the outside world, like investors, who you're trying to serve and why you're the right person to serve those people, because you've considered this kind of entire universe that operates around the user, not just the user themselves. So it ends up being a pretty powerful grounding force for gaining alignment within the organization, and then like I said, kind of externally as well. It also is something that uncovers risks to the project, and perhaps maybe more importantly, actually, allies that you should involve in the design process, because a lot of times when you see that there is kind of a stakeholder that can green light or red light your project with a user, just based on how much influence they have, you can get those people in the design process early as advocates. And it also gives you an opportunity to suss out where there might be, quote unquote, enemies for you in the design process as well. And so you can kind of account for them, you can get their buy-in, you can work with them to make the design help them as well as the user. It's so much better to find those things out early on, instead of find them out once you've launched your product.
Right. I mean, that totally makes sense. And also, I think, especially in the Web3 world and blockchain, I feel like a lot of projects within blockchain are built around market making, which is already kind of inherently kind of a complex product, because you're having to understand not just the behaviors of one person, but the behaviors of two types of people, two actors within the stage. And within those, you have so many different factors kind of playing in. And just in general, even if it's not a market making product, it's generally speaking, if it's blockchain related, if it's something built on blockchain, it's probably going to be more complex. There's probably going to be more actors involved. And so the stakeholder mapping seems to me to be a really good way of kind of understanding that complex sort of ecosystem of incentives and then aligning them. Incentive alignment is something that you'll hear a lot on crypto Twitter. And I feel like stakeholder mapping is like one of those key tools that we have in order to kind of understand that and kind of like work towards an equitable incentive alignment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm in. That sounds amazing. How do I make one?
Yeah, so basically it starts the same way as everything we've talked about so far, which is you're deciding what your subject is, which in this case should be your use case. So if you haven't listened to our episode on use cases, go back to the beginning and listen to that one. So there's a couple ways you could get started. So first of all, if you, for example, have not done any research, or you don't have time, or the quintessential research is too expensive or whatever, I'm going to let that one slide for now, even though I would highly recommend you make time.
And when you say quintessential research, you mean eight to 10 interviews is what you're talking about, like based
Yeah.
off of what we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, so basically, like, either you have gone into the field and studied, the field, and studied people that fit your user and use case to understand what's going on, in which case you have a treasure trove of insights from which to pull for building your stakeholder map. If you have not done that, that's okay. And in some cases, it can actually be better that you haven't invested all that research time yet, because you might not know who to interview in addition to the main user. So if that's the case, what you need to do is basically get people who are also familiar with the use case and the people involved in the use case to basically help you build one in a joint session. So you would be, instead of doing it yourself, where you're like sitting around a table by yourself, kind of architecting it out based on the research, which is also a fine way to do it, you would be working with a group of people to co-develop this kind of artifact, which is really fun. It's a generative experience, and it kind of involves other people, so you're kind of checking each other's assumptions and biases throughout the process. You can also do a hybrid where you're using your research, but you're also bringing in people who fit the stakeholders. So that can be kind of a dual way to do it. And so basically what you do is, first and foremost, and this is, I think a lot of people get hung up on, well, I have to make it visual and it's going to be hard and I don't know how to draw and I don't know how to do this. The first thing you want to do is just actually make a list. So you want to make as exhaustive a list as possible of all the stakeholders. So when you were doing your research, or when you're talking to these other people who are involved in your use case, who does the user interact with? Who do those people interact with? What entities or businesses surround them? What agendas do they have? Basically, like, you want to write this list down so you have it somewhere where you can reference it, and therefore you aren't kind of chained to the actual diagram that you're building. In the beginning, you're actually just trying to make an exhaustive list. So you can group like stakeholders together into larger groups if you like. That's one of the best things that comes out of making a list first. So for example, if you're building a stakeholder map for a space organization and you've listed out all of the national space agencies separately, like NASA, ESA, the Chinese Space Agency, and you have kind of this exhaustive list, and you might think, okay, well, NASA and ESA definitely interact with my space organization the same way, because they are both government space agencies. Then you might be able to group them into a group of government space agencies that would then serve as one stakeholder on your map. The key to this is that you make sure that the interactions and influences this group has is uniform and consistent among the members in the group. So if this was the group that you made and you knew that the European Space Agency and NASA, the United States Space Agency, behave differently with your company, then it would not be appropriate to put them in a group where they are government-run space agencies. But if they do behave the same, then it's okay, and that would make it basically drastically reduces the complexity of your map. It makes it a lot easier to manage later. Once you have the complete list, basically now you can move to starting to develop a visual diagram. So you're going to start a new sheet of paper. It could be digital, could be physical, up to you. We can talk about some tips for which ones I prefer later. And basically what you're going to do is draw a little icon for each list member, and then write a little speech bubble to summarize their mindset. So like the goal they're trying to accomplish, things that come into play for them, things that influence their decision-making and their behavior. Make sure to leave a lot of space so you can draw lines to connect them later. It doesn't really matter where they go for now, as long as they can move around and or be connected to each other later.
When you say like draw lines and connect them, what is the setting that these things typically take place in? Is this like a real IRL, whiteboard, mural, like digital, like how do you think about sort of organizing this sort of event?
Yeah, so it's completely up to you. I think there are multiple ways to do it. It's really where, first of all, It depends on how you're running the session. So if there are multiple of you, it makes it a lot easier to be doing it in a physical place. If you're together, obviously, if you're remote, then a digital place. It's very hard to take video of whiteboard and share with others, it turns out. If you're in the same place, a whiteboard's great. Post-it notes are great. What's not great is probably writing it on a sheet of paper. Where you cannot physically move things around once they're on the paper. If you can do that, if you can like draw them and erase them and move them around, that's going to be a lot more helpful. So whatever medium you choose, just make sure that you're able to do that. So that can be Post-it notes, that can be, whiteboard, that can be Mural. If you don't have access to Mural, frankly, Figma is a great design tool as well. And there's a couple more that we'll reference. There's actually like a specific map making tool. I can't quite remember the name of it at this moment, but we're going to put it in the notes so that you can see it. Oh, it's called Smaply, Smaply. Yeah, okay. Smaply. That's a great place to get started as well. So, there's lots of software out there that supports building things like this. The only thing that really matters is that you don't have it locked down where you can't move it if something changes. Because as you can imagine, what's coming next is that you're going to have this discussion about how they connect to each other.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So, and is that kind of this initial sort of bucketing piece, is that kind of considered a draft? Like, are you already making connections, or are you starting to kind of put people, do you want to refrain from that beforehand?
Yeah, so I like to do it first where I have their kind of goals written out next to them. So their little speech bubble and their little icon is already created next to the list, so that I'm not kind of getting distracted by the fact that I'm trying to orient them in 2 dimensions just yet. Because once you've written out all the goals of all these people, it should start to be a little bit more obvious, like, oh, okay, well, these 3 need to be near each other because there's going to be lines that connect them, right? Like they influence each other, they're in the same universe or whatever. So there's plenty of examples. And again, like we're going to put a bunch of examples or links to examples. The book Mapping Experiences is a great reference for those of you who don't have access to that book. It's not that expensive. You can probably get access pretty quickly, and they have PDF versions. That
Local
book
libraries, people.
Yeah, that book is great.
Yes.
Tons and tons of examples. So I would check that out. Basically, then what happens is once you've got this exhaustive list, you are going to move them into a 2-dimensional space and orient them where you can kind of see them all together, where you can start to draw arrows and lines and boxes to connect the different stakeholders. And the point of that is basically to be able to show the influence that they have on each other, capturing how they relate to each other. And then you basically write that next to the line, again, on a Post-it, or the line itself can be digital and able to move. So this might be one stakeholder delivering a good or service to another, or a group of stakeholders that implement and enforce laws that a different group has to abide by. Basically capture any of this, any and all that comes to mind. And this is where the discussion happens. Basically, this should be a tiring exercise. By the end, you should be unable to come up with another relationship, right? Because you've exhausted it. And it is going to get complicated fast. So as you're going, the other thing is that you might identify larger groups, like kind of super groups almost. And basically, like I said, you're going to want to make sure that those guys are near each other physically. And you might be able to, add in hierarchies if you need them to signal kind of how they relate as a super group throughout.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, so now we have the draft.
Yeah.
Like, what do we do after that?
Yeah, so we've talked about this a little bit in some of the other sessions, but this is a perfect time to basically show people your map. And again, like if you haven't done research yet, this is a great artifact to take with you when you start to get out in the field and do research, because it is a visual artifact that is very easy to understand. It's complicated, and making it was complicated, but looking at it as a new person, especially if you're familiar with the use case, should be very familiar. If you're familiar with the use case and you're just out in the world and someone comes up to you with a stakeholder map, I mean, so imagine that you're someone who has recently been undergoing chemotherapy, and you see a stakeholder map for chemotherapy patients, and it connects hospital administrators to doctors, to nurses, to insurance people, to family and friends, to you, the patient, to medical device manufacturers. That would be an example of a stakeholder map that has a lot of different facets. But if someone brought that to your attention as a cancer patient, someone going through it, you should be able to look at that map very quickly and identify, yep, that looks a lot like my universe. So basically, you're showing it to people who would be on the map. So you would be showing it, if you're building something for the cancer patient, you would certainly be showing it to the cancer patient, but you could also show it to a hospital administrator or an insurance executive, and they should recognize it as an ecosystem in which they are a participant. And what happens is you're getting that validation really early on, so that you get a complete picture of what's going on, or learn that you're missing something. And you can quickly refine your map. And that's why you want to make sure that it's a living, breathing artifact. So ultimately, that's where digital maps end up being helpful, because long term, you're going to be iterating and validating with real people and needing to update or add as you see fit.
That totally makes sense. And I kind of love the idea of doing user testing on your research artifacts. That's
Yeah.
great. What
Yeah,
other,
it's super helpful, actually.
I mean, I mean, it totally makes sense. It's almost, I think of UX as almost, it's just, you have like the full revolution of the ideation, research, validation piece, and then iterate. And then you just have like micro sort of wheels within that. It's just wheels within wheels. So, what other best practices should I employ when I'm making these things?
Yeah, so like I said, you're just going to want to make sure everything is movable, because the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to draw it once and you're going to have to redraw it. That's what happened to me the first time I made a stakeholder map, is I drew
This
it
is
on
what you don't
paper.
want it on like paper. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it was fun and awesome to kind of draw on paper and feel like I was making something, but then the second you have to change something, I basically had to cut up my paper and tape the cut up parts to a new piece of paper. And you do that once and you're like, this is terrible. So separate small pieces of Post-its. If you're going to do it on paper, again, like, to me, digital methods like are great, but make sure you're using something that's easily editable, and preferably editable by multiple people. So that's where Figma is a great tool. I don't know about Smaply, but it's another one that's highly recommended to get started. We'll link it in the thing. But there's tons of other tools out there. This is not the time for you to learn how to use Adobe Illustrator to make a stakeholder map. I also have made that mistake, where I wanted it to be really high fidelity. I was working with a great designer at the time. She kind of made this draft for me in Illustrator based on something I had made on paper. And what happened was, very quickly it became unusable for me as things were changing. So this is not the time to try out like a new, very heavyweight software that you've been wanting to learn how to use, because if you're going to be Googling how to make an arc in Adobe Illustrator, not that that actually happened to me, then you're going to really regret it, because it's going to be a pain in the butt. And there's just so many better tools out there to use, like Figma, Sketch, and some of these other specific tools around journey mapping or stakeholder mapping, that you just don't need to go to the trouble. So,
Right. I mean, that makes sense. And the more, I think the more influx it is, it's almost like painting, right? Like you don't want to have to be sketching out to kind of figure out your ideas. When something is in flux or in transit, you don't necessarily want to sketch in oil paints. You want to sketch in lead or graphite. So that totally makes sense to me. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about whenever we're doing the stakeholder map exercise?
No, I mean, I think as you start to get familiar with stakeholder mapping, you're going to see that it's so valuable in terms of visually communicating your use case to people, because especially like you alluded to with blockchain and Web3 technology, it's so complicated. And the fact that almost always there's at least two parties that have to show up at the same time for any of these businesses to take off, multi-sided marketplaces. Some cases it's N parties have to show up at the same time. And again, like the more that you can start to visualize that and see the influential pieces that all have to fall into place, it will become very clear to you that the business you're trying to build, even if, for example, the end user interface is simple, the ecosystem is not. And the sooner the better that you know that as a business person and as an entrepreneur, so that you can start to figure out, like, how are you going to create an ecosystem that is ready to migrate onto this blockchain technology or onto this new solution that you've created. Yeah, I think in combination with some of the things we've talked about in previous episodes, like the user and use case, you're starting to flesh out a much broader, deeper understanding of the problem. And when you go out to the world to communicate that, whether that's to get buy-in, whether that's to get people to use your product, whether that's to get investors, whether that's to get people to join your team, having those very visible, clear, deep, rich artifacts is an enormous kind of check in the box for you as an entrepreneur to show people that you've actually done your homework and you've thought carefully about that. So yeah, and we have one more visualization technique that we'll talk about in the following episode, which is basically called journey mapping or experience mapping, and that will talk specifically about one person's journey through the use case. One user type rather. And I think once you see that combined with stakeholder mapping, combined with, user and use case diagrams that we talked about earlier, and then all of that backed up by the research that we've talked about, through ethnography and contextual inquiry and interviewing, you'll see that if you really do this kind of stuff, A, it does not have to be so super heavy-handed, and B, you can very quickly ascertain, level up, collect and catalog and share what's kind of going on across a user use case scenario that makes you well-positioned and blockchain well-positioned to change that experience for them. So yeah, we hope you'll check that one out too.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Katie. I'll see you in 30 seconds to record the next one, Journey Maps.
Sounds good. Bye.